My overbearing helicopter mom monitored my every step and ruled my adult life. You have to understand the level of surveillance I lived under. My mother had tracking apps on my phone, cameras in my apartment that she paid for. She called my boss every single week just to check in and make sure I was actually at work. I was 26 years old, for crying out loud, with a master's degree. But she still controlled my bedtime, calling at exactly 9:30 every night to make sure I was home. If I didn't answer, oh, she'd drive right over, use her spare key, and let herself in to verify I was sleeping. Every Sunday, she'd pick out my clothes for the entire week. Then, each morning, a video call. I'd have to spin around to prove I hadn't changed anything. She logged into my bank account daily, scrutinizing every single purchase, and would absolutely scream if I bought a coffee without her permission. My work schedule? Memorized. She'd show up randomly to eat lunch with me, telling my coworkers she was just a loving mother. She'd even sit in on my doctor's appointments, answering questions for me before I could open my mouth. I had to share my location at all times. She'd text, demanding to know why I stopped at a red light for too long. My email passwords? She had them. She read everything before I did, replying to friends as me if she didn't like their influence. She controlled what I ate, doing my grocery shopping, then counting items to ensure I hadn't eaten extra portions. A camera in my car monitored my driving, and she'd call while I was on the road, critiquing my lane changes. Friends? Oh, she picked those too. Anyone I mentioned got a background check. If they had a parking ticket or a lower education than hers, I was forbidden from seeing them. My haircuts, my dentist appointments, my free time, even my bathroom breaks were scheduled. She'd text reminders to stay hydrated, so I'd need to go every 2 hours. All of this, she said, was to protect me from making mistakes because I wasn't capable of taking care of myself. She'd tell people I had anxiety and needed her guidance to function. It was a lie she'd repeated so often, everyone believed it. When I tried to set boundaries, she'd burst into tears, wailing that I was ungrateful for all her sacrifices. She'd threatened to hurt herself if I abandoned her. She'd already convinced my extended family I was fragile and needed constant supervision, so they'd call me selfish when I complained. She knew my every move, every thought, every plan because she'd installed keyloggers on my devices and had trained me since childhood to report everything or face her wrath. The breaking point? When she sabotaged a job offer I got in another state. She called the company herself, declined on my behalf, and told them I had mental health issues preventing relocation. That was it. I snapped. That's when I met Jessica. We were at a coffee shop. She looked exactly like me, similar height, build with the right hair color. She was an actress between gigs, needing money, and willing to do anything legal. I hired her. My desperate escape plan began. For $2,000 a month, Jessica would be me. I gave her my old phone with all the tracking apps, taught her my entire routine. Every night at 9:25 p.m., she'd go to my apartment and answer my mother's call. She'd wear the outfits my mother picked, send the morning spin videos. She'd drive my car on the routes my mother expected while I used a rental. She'd buy the groceries, eat the measured portions. Jessica was brilliant at it. She even copied my voice and mannerisms. My mother never suspected a thing because all the devices showed exactly what she expected. Meanwhile, I moved. A furnished apartment across town, paid for in cash. A new company, completely remote, that my mother knew nothing about. For the first time in my life, I was free. Jessica played the role of the controlled daughter perfectly. My mother was thrilled. She bragged to her friends about how her monitoring system had finally made me the perfect daughter. She even increased her control, adding more check-ins and rules, which Jessica, ever the professional, followed flawlessly, earning extra pay for her troubles. After 3 months of this bizarre, liberating charade, I invited my mother to lunch at a restaurant she'd never let me eat at, calling it unhealthy. She arrived expecting Jessica. Instead, she got me, looking different. New haircut, she hadn't approved. Wearing clothes she'd never picked. Sitting confidently, not the anxious mess she'd created. I looked her dead in the eye and told her, "Mom, you've been controlling a stranger for months." I showed her pictures of my real apartment, my real job, my real life. She went utterly pale. She started calling my phone frantic. But Jessica answered from my old apartment, following the script perfectly. My mother screamed that I'd betrayed her, that she'd just been protecting me. She threatened to cut me off financially. I just laughed. And then I showed her my bank statements for my new job. I was making twice what my old job paid. Her face cycled through red, then white, then red again. Her fingers shook as she pressed the call button on her phone over and over. Each time, Jessica's calm, collected voice came through from my old apartment, saying she was home, everything was fine. My mother's voice got louder with each failed attempt to grasp what was happening. She demanded to know how long I'd been lying, if I'd lost my mind, if I understood what I'd done. A couple at the next table glanced over. Then the family 2 tables away. Soon, half the restaurant was watching us. Forks paused halfway to mouths. I kept my voice steady, explained the whole setup. 3 months of freedom while she tracked Jessica. Every morning spin video, every 9:30 p.m. call. Every grocery trip following her exact list. Every single check-in she thought proved her system worked actually proved I could escape it completely. Her face went from shock to rage so fast I barely saw the transition. She lunged across the table, her hand reaching for my phone, like she could somehow undo everything if she just grabbed it. I pulled back fast. The waiter appeared beside our table, eyes darting between us, asking if everything was okay. My mother's entire body language changed in an instant. The anger melted into tears. Her voice became soft, shaky. She told the waiter I was having a mental health crisis, that she was my caretaker, trying to help me. She said I'd stopped taking my medication and wasn't thinking clearly, that she just needed to get me home safely. I pulled out my driver's license. I showed it to him. "Sir, I'm 26 years old. I'm having a private conversation with my mother, and I don't need any help." The waiter backed away, but he didn't go far. He stood near the bar watching. My mother's hands were shaking as she pulled out her phone again. She said she was calling the police to report Jessica for fraud and identity theft. She said what I'd done was illegal and Jessica would go to jail. "Go ahead, Mom," I said. "Make the call. I'd be happy to explain to the police how you've been illegally watching an adult woman through cameras and tracking apps. I'll show them the keyloggers on my devices. I'll explain how you controlled my bank account and sabotaged my job offer." Her finger hovered over the screen. She didn't dial. She put the phone down and her whole face crumpled. The tears came harder now. Real ones this time, not the performative ones. She sobbed that I'd betrayed her after everything she'd sacrificed. She started listing things from when I was 5 years old, the dance classes, staying up all night when I had the flu, the car she bought me for college, every birthday, every doctor visit, every single moment she was there for me. Her voice got louder and louder, building to how ungrateful I was, how cruel, how she'd given me everything and I'd thrown it back in her face. I let her finish. I waited until she ran out of words and just sat there, breathing hard. Then I said quietly, "Love doesn't need surveillance cameras. Protecting someone doesn't mean controlling what clothes they wear when they're 26. Being a good parent means letting your adult child make their own choices." She screamed back that I clearly couldn't take care of myself. She said hiring someone to pretend to be me proved I was unstable. "If you were capable of adulting," she spat, "you would have just talked to me instead of running away and lying." Every person in the restaurant was staring now. Some even had their phones out. The manager walked over, looking worried and uncomfortable. My mother saw him coming and switched modes again, instantly. "My mentally ill daughter is having an episode," she told him, using that same soft, scared voice that made her sound like the victim. She needs help getting home safely. The manager looked at me with concern and pity. I pulled out my phone, opened my photos. I showed him pictures of my new apartment with my name on the lease. My remote work setup, company laptop visible. My bank statements showing my job deposits and my rent payments. I explained calmly, I'm simply demonstrating to my mother that I'm a capable adult with my own life. The manager's expression changed. He turned to my mother and asked her to please lower her voice or leave the restaurant. She looked at him like he'd slapped her. Then she got mad at him instead, saying he had no idea what he was talking about, that I'd clearly manipulated him just like I manipulated everyone. My mother grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit. I watched her go through the front door and thought that was it. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath. Then I looked out the window and saw her, standing in the parking lot. She was calling my phone again. I could see her pacing back and forth between the cars. I paid for both our meals, even though neither of us had touched the food. The waiter looked relieved when I left a big tip. I asked him which way to the back exit, and he pointed towards the kitchen. I took 3 different buses, even though my apartment was only 4 miles away. I got off each bus after a few stops, waited for the next one. I kept checking behind me to make sure she hadn't somehow followed. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. After the 3rd bus, I walked the final 6 blocks, taking random turns, doubling back twice. When I finally got to my building and unlocked my door, I made it inside and turned all 3 locks. Then, I just sat down on the floor, my back against the door. My whole body started shaking. My hands, my legs, even my jaw. The adrenaline that had kept me calm through the whole restaurant scene crashed all at once. I sat there for 20 minutes, just shaking, trying to breathe normally, processing what had just happened and what it meant. There was no going back now. That evening, my phone rang. Jessica's number. I picked up and heard her breathing hard, like she'd been running. She told me my mother had just shown up at the old apartment building, pounding on the door and screaming to be let in. Jessica, ever the actress, opened the door just wide enough to speak through the chain lock and calmly explain that our arrangement was finished. She was moving out tomorrow, and there was nothing more to discuss. My mother had tried to push past her, yelling that she needed to see me, that it was her apartment, that Jessica had no right to keep her out. Jessica closed the door and called building security while my mother banged on it from the hallway. Security arrived within minutes and escorted my mother out, who was still screaming that her daughter was being held hostage by a con artist. The guard apparently told her she needed to leave or they'd call the police. Jessica said my mother stood in the parking lot for another 20 minutes, staring up at the apartment windows before finally driving away. I thanked Jessica for handling it so professionally, and she laughed, saying it was the strangest acting gig she'd ever had, but also the most meaningful. She asked if I was okay, and I realized I was shaking again just from hearing about the confrontation secondhand. My phone started ringing at 10:30 that night. My mother's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. She called again immediately, and again, and again. I counted 37 calls over the next 6 hours. I forced myself to listen to 3 of the voicemails before I couldn't take any more. The first was her sobbing, begging me to call her back, saying she was sorry for everything, just wanted to talk. The second, she was screaming that I was an ungrateful liar who'd betrayed the person who loved me most in the world. The third was calm, measured, explaining in a rational tone why I clearly wasn't thinking straight and needed her guidance to make good decisions. She said hiring Jessica proved I wasn't stable enough to be on my own, but that she'd always be there for me when I came to my senses. I sat on my couch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I opened the settings and blocked her number. My finger hovered over the button for a full minute before I finally pressed it. The silence after felt both terrifying and relieving at the same time. The next morning, I woke up to 17 emails in my work inbox. I scrolled past the usual project updates until I saw one from Flora, my boss, with the subject line, "Personal matter to discuss." My stomach dropped. I opened it. She'd received a concerning phone call yesterday afternoon from someone claiming to be my mother. The person had said I was struggling with serious mental health issues and that Flora should be aware I might not be reliable for work. Flora's email was professional but kind, saying she wanted to give me the opportunity to discuss this privately. She emphasized that my job performance had been excellent and nothing about this call changed that. I stared at the email for 10 minutes, my heart pounding. My mother had, somehow, found my new company. I checked my LinkedIn profile and realized I'd updated my job title 2 weeks ago, but forgotten to make my profile private. That's how she'd tracked down the company name. I scheduled a video call with Flora for that afternoon. When her face appeared on my screen, she looked concerned, but not judgmental. I took a breath and started explaining everything from the beginning. The tracking apps, the cameras, the daily check-ins, the clothing approvals, the financial monitoring. Flora's expression shifted from concern to horror as I showed her screenshots of the surveillance apps I'd saved as evidence. I pulled out my old phone and demonstrated how the tracking worked, showing her the detailed location history. I explained about Jessica, the 3 months of deception, and finally confronting my mother at the restaurant. Flora was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said she was horrified by what I'd been through and impressed by my resourcefulness in escaping it. She assured me my job was completely secure and that she'd flag my mother's number in their system as harassment. If my mother called again, they'd handle it at the company level without involving me. Tears pricked at my eyes and I blinked them back. Flora noticed. She said it was okay to cry, that what I'd been through was traumatic, and I didn't have to hold it together for her benefit. She then mentioned her wife, Gladys, was a therapist specializing in family issues, especially control and unhealthy boundaries. Gladys had helped several clients with similar dynamics, and Flora offered to connect us. I accepted immediately, surprising myself with how quickly I said yes. Flora smiled and said she'd have Gladys reach out. She asked if there was anything else the company could do to support me. I thanked her, but said just knowing my job was safe, that my mother couldn't interfere with it, meant everything. After the call ended, I sat staring at my blank screen. Having someone believe me and support me without question felt strange, and so incredibly good. I realized I'd been bracing for Flora to side with my mother, or at least question my version of events. Instead, she just believed me and offered help. My phone started buzzing with calls and texts that evening. Numbers I didn't recognize, but area codes that belonged to my extended family. My mother had clearly escalated to the next level of her campaign. I let the calls go to voicemail and watched the texts pile up. My Aunt Linda wrote that she'd just spoken with my mother, who was beside herself with worry. My Uncle Frank sent a long message about family loyalty and how I shouldn't abandon my mother in her time of need. My cousin Betty texted asking if I was okay, saying my mother had told everyone I was having some kind of breakdown. Within 3 hours, I had messages from 12 different relatives, most of whom I hadn't heard from in over a year. Some were concerned and gentle, asking if I needed help. Others were accusatory, saying I was being selfish and cruel. All of them had clearly gotten their information from my mother's version of events. I read through every message, my anger building with each one. They all believed I was the problem. They all thought my mother was the victim here. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email to the entire extended family. I wrote out the truth in clear, simple terms. The tracking apps, the cameras, the daily clothing approvals and financial surveillance, the controlled schedule, the forced check-ins, the job sabotage. I explained that I'd hired Jessica to escape this system because my mother refused to respect any boundaries I tried to set. I attached screenshots of the tracking app interfaces, photos of the camera setup in my old apartment with timestamps, copies of text exchanges where my mother demanded to know why I'd stopped at a red light or bought coffee without permission. I wrote that I loved my family, but needed them to understand the full truth before judging my decisions. I read through the email 3 times, editing and refining it. Then I added every family member's email address I had and hit send before I could second-guess myself. Responses started coming in within an hour. My Aunt Jessica called immediately, crying and apologizing. She said she'd always thought my mother's behavior seemed extreme, but didn't feel it was her place to interfere. Now, the screenshots made it clear this went far beyond normal parental concern. My Aunt Linda sent a similar message, horrified, asking what she could do to support me. But then the angry responses started arriving. My Uncle Frank wrote that I was clearly exaggerating and making my mother look bad to justify my own selfish choices. My cousin Mike said the screenshots could easily be faked and that I was probably having a mental health crisis, just like my mother said. My Uncle Tom sent a long email about how parents have a right to protect their children and that my mother was just being cautious in a dangerous world. 3 of my cousins sent shorter messages calling me ungrateful and saying I should be ashamed. I read each response and watched my family split down the middle in real time. My mother sent her own email to the family list within 2 hours. She claimed I doctored all the screenshots using photo editing software. She said Jessica was a con artist who'd manipulated me and convinced me to turn against my loving mother. She attached old emails from when I was 17, struggling with anxiety in high school, using them as evidence that I wasn't mentally stable enough to make good decisions now. She wrote that she'd only been trying to help me manage my anxiety by providing structure and support. She said she was devastated that I'd twisted her love and concern into something sinister. She ended the email by saying she was praying for me and hoped I'd get the help I needed before I destroyed my life completely. I read her email twice and felt my hands start shaking again. She was good at this, at making herself the victim and me the unstable one. Some of my family members would believe her version. Maybe most of them would. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message said it was Khaled from my old job and that he'd seen my updated LinkedIn profile. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee and catch up. I stared at the message for a minute, trying to remember Khaled clearly. He'd worked in a different department, but we'd talked sometimes in the break room. He'd always been friendly and easy to talk to. I texted back, agreeing to meet the next day at a coffee shop near my new apartment. When I arrived, he was already there with 2 cups on the table. He stood up and hugged me, which surprised me. He said I looked different, more relaxed than he remembered. We sat down, and he asked how I'd been since leaving the company. I gave him the short version first, testing how much I could trust him. I said I'd moved to a new job and a new apartment and was working on setting better boundaries with my family. He nodded and said that made sense. Then he told me his own mother had similar controlling habits. Not as extreme as what I described, but enough that he understood family dynamics could be complicated. I felt something relax in my chest. I told him the full story, watching his face for signs of judgment or disbelief. Instead, he just listened, nodded, and asked questions that showed he really understood. When I finished, he said he was glad I'd gotten out and that it took real courage to break free from that kind of control. We talked for 2 more hours about family and boundaries and the guilt that came with choosing yourself over what your parents wanted. When I finally left, I felt lighter than I had in days. I walked back to my apartment that night, replaying every moment of the coffee conversation with Khaled. The next morning, I opened my laptop and searched for the HR contact information from my old company. I found the email address for the woman who'd handled my original job offer, the one my mother had sabotaged. I drafted a message explaining who I was and asking if she remembered the phone call from my mother declining the out-of-state position on my behalf. I hit send before I could overthink it. She responded within 3 hours. Her email said she remembered the call very clearly because it had struck her as unusual that a parent would decline a job offer for an adult employee. She wrote that several managers had questioned the situation after I left, wondering if the mental health claims were legitimate or if something else was going on. She said my mother's call had violated company policy about who could make employment decisions, and she documented it at the time in case there were legal issues later. She offered to send me the official documentation if I needed evidence for any purpose. I read her email twice, feeling something tight in my chest start to loosen. Someone in authority had found my mother's behavior strange. Someone had questioned it. Someone had written it down. I replied, thanking her and asking for copies of everything she had. She sent 3 documents within an hour, all with timestamps and notes about the conversation with my mother. I saved them in a folder labeled Evidence and added them to the growing collection of proof that I wasn't crazy or ungrateful or wrong. Flora had given me her wife's contact information the day before, and I'd been staring at it for hours, trying to decide if I was ready for therapy. I finally texted the number and asked if she had any availability. She responded asking if I could come in that afternoon, which felt both too soon and exactly what I needed. I showed up at her office 15 minutes early and sat in my car, trying to calm my breathing. When I finally walked inside, she greeted me with a warm smile and led me to a comfortable room with soft lighting and plants on every surface. I spent the first 20 minutes just explaining the basics of my mother's control system. She listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes, but mostly just watching my face. When I finished, she leaned forward and said that what I described was severe enmeshment combined with what sounded like an anxiety disorder. She explained that my mother probably genuinely believed she was protecting me from harm, but that her mental health issues didn't create an obligation for me to sacrifice my autonomy. She said the tracking apps and cameras and constant monitoring weren't love. They were symptoms of my mother's inability to manage her own anxiety without controlling everyone around her. I sat there, processing her words, feeling tears start to build behind my eyes. Someone with credentials and education was telling me I wasn't the problem. Someone was saying my mother's behavior wasn't normal parenting. We spent the rest of the session talking about boundaries and what healthy relationships looked like. She asked if I wanted help setting clear limits with my mother, and I said yes immediately. She pulled out a notepad and we drafted a letter together, working through several versions until we had something that felt right. The letter explained that I was willing to rebuild a relationship only if my mother respected my independence as an adult and attended therapy to address her anxiety. It said I wouldn't respond to tracking attempts, surprise visits, or contact through third parties. It listed specific boundaries about my finances, my home, my work, and my personal life. It ended by saying I hoped we could find a healthier way to be family, but that I wouldn't sacrifice my well-being to manage her emotions anymore. I typed up the final version when I got home and printed it at the library. I took it to the post office and sent it via certified mail so I'd have proof she received it. The clerk handed me the receipt, and I folded it carefully into my wallet next to the HR documentation. I was building a paper trail without really planning to, just collecting evidence that I'd tried to do this the right way. Jessica called me 3 days later, sounding shaken. She said my mother had shown up at my old apartment building that morning, apparently having forgotten or not accepting that Jessica had moved out weeks ago. She tried to force her way past the front desk, demanding to see me, and the building manager had called the police when she wouldn't leave. Jessica had heard about it from the security guard who'd helped her move her stuff out. She said the police had escorted my mother off the property and given her a trespass warning. I thanked Jessica for telling me, and we talked for a few more minutes about how she was doing. She admitted the whole experience had opened her eyes to toxic family patterns she'd been ignoring in her own life. She said she'd started therapy too, working through some stuff with her parents that she'd always written off as normal. We promised to stay in touch and hung up. I felt relieved that my mother had gone to the old apartment instead of finding my new place. That relief lasted exactly 4 more days. I came home from grocery shopping on a Tuesday afternoon and saw her car parked across the street from my building. My stomach dropped and I almost turned around to leave, but then I saw my building manager standing on the sidewalk talking to 2 police officers. I parked in my usual spot and walked over, my hand shaking as I approached. The building manager saw me and waved me over. He introduced himself as Mateo and explained that my mother had tried to bribe him for my unit number an hour ago. When he'd refused, she'd parked outside and refused to leave. He'd called the police immediately because he took resident privacy seriously. One of the officers asked if I was the daughter in question, and I said yes. I pulled out my phone and showed them the boundary letter I'd sent, then the trespass incident report from my old building that Jessica had forwarded to me. I explained the situation calmly, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. The officer nodded and said they'd informed my mother she needed to leave and that continued contact could result in a restraining order. They walked over to her car, and I watched from the sidewalk as they spoke to her through the window. She got out crying, gesturing toward me and talking fast. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could see her face, the tears streaming down her cheeks, the desperate hand movements. One officer looked back at me with what might have been sympathy. My mother kept talking, and I saw her pull out her phone, probably showing them something. The officer's expression changed from sympathy to confusion. He walked back over to me and asked if I'd be willing to explain the situation in more detail. I took a breath and told him about the 3 months of deception, about hiring Jessica to live my life while I escaped. I showed him the tracking apps still installed on my old phone, explained how they worked, demonstrated how my mother had been monitoring someone else without knowing it. I showed him the screenshots of her daily check-ins with Jessica, the clothing approval videos, the location tracking data. His face shifted from confusion to understanding as he realized this wasn't a simple case of a concerned parent worried about a troubled daughter. He went back to my mother's car and spoke to her again, this time with a firmer tone. She started crying harder, but he didn't change his stance. He told her she needed to leave immediately and that any further contact would be documented. She sat in her car sobbing for another 5 minutes before finally starting the engine and driving away. The officers gave me an incident report number and suggested I consider a restraining order if she continued showing up. They left, and I stood on the sidewalk, trying to stop shaking. Mateo walked over and offered to install an additional lock on my door at no charge. He said he'd never give out my information regardless of who asked or what story they told. His kindness was so simple and matter-of-fact that it broke something loose inside me. I started crying right there on the sidewalk. The first real tears since the restaurant confrontation. He didn't try to comfort me or tell me it would be okay. He just stood there quietly until I stopped, then walked me to my apartment and measured my door for the new lock. The week after the police escort felt like living in a fog where every sound made me freeze. A car door slamming outside sent me to the window. Footsteps in the hallway made my heart race. I checked the locks 3 times before bed and woke up at every noise, convinced she'd found a way in. At work, I jumped when Flora sent me a message. I couldn't focus during meetings. Gladys, my therapist, noticed. She explained this was normal after what I'd been through, that my body was stuck in fight or flight mode. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques, ways to remind myself I was actually safe now. We practiced what to do if my mother showed up again. She helped me understand that healing wouldn't be linear. Some days I'd feel strong. Others, I'd feel like that scared person my mother had created. 8 days after the police incident, my doorbell rang at 7 a.m. I froze on my couch, coffee cup halfway to my mouth. It rang again. I crept to the peephole, half expecting to see my mother's face. Instead, it was my Aunt Betty, one of the 2 who'd been supportive. She stood in the hallway, holding an envelope, looking uncomfortable. I opened the door with the chain still on. She held up the envelope and apologized for coming unannounced, but said my mother had asked her to deliver a letter. Her voice was tired. She looked like she hadn't slept well. She said my mother seemed genuinely broken, that she'd never seen her like this. I took the envelope through the gap. Betty said she understood if I wasn't ready for contact and respected my boundaries. She turned to leave, then stopped. "I'm proud of you for getting out," she said. I closed the door and stared at the envelope for 20 minutes before opening it. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten in my mother's neat script. She said she'd started therapy and was beginning to understand how her anxiety had hurt me. She wanted to make amends and rebuild our relationship in a healthy way. The first 2 pages sounded genuine, talking about things her therapist had helped her see. Then the 3rd page shifted, how she couldn't sleep or eat, how her blood pressure was dangerously high, how the stress of losing me was destroying her health. She described lying awake, crying every night, unable to function at work, losing weight she couldn't afford to lose. She said her doctor was worried and that the therapist said family reconciliation would help her recovery. The 4th page begged me to at least talk to her, saying she was trying so hard but couldn't do it without me. I read it twice, feeling my chest tighten with guilt, then called Gladys, even though it wasn't our scheduled time. Gladys talked me through it, helping me see how the genuine progress mixed with manipulation at the end. She pointed out how my mother made her health my responsibility, how the letter was designed to make me feel like I was hurting her by maintaining boundaries. Gladys said people could make real progress in therapy while still using old patterns when they got desperate. I decided to focus on building my actual life instead of getting pulled back into managing my mother's emotions. I'd seen a flyer for a hiking group at the coffee shop near my apartment and signed up online. The first meetup was on a Saturday morning at a trailhead 30 minutes outside the city. I almost didn't go, worried I'd be awkward or wouldn't fit in, but I forced myself into my car. 15 people showed up. The organizer paired us up, and I ended up walking with a woman around my age who introduced herself as Kylie. We chatted about easy stuff at first. Then she asked what I did for work, and I relaxed, talking about my remote job. She mentioned she was a nurse at the Children's Hospital and lived with a roommate who was an actress. Something clicked in my brain. I asked if her roommate's name was Jessica. Kylie's eyes went wide. She said yes and asked how I knew. I explained I was the person Jessica had been impersonating for 3 months. Kylie stopped walking and stared at me, then started laughing. She said Jessica had told her about the job, but she'd thought it sounded too weird to be real. We spent the rest of the hike talking about the whole situation. By the end of the trail, we'd exchanged numbers and made plans to get coffee. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks, realizing I actually enjoyed talking to people when I wasn't exhausted from my mother's constant demands. 3 weeks after the restaurant confrontation, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A man's voice introduced himself as an attorney representing my mother and said she was pursuing legal action to recover money she'd spent on my apartment and living expenses over the years. His voice sounded uncomfortable, and he spoke quickly. He listed amounts for rent, groceries, utilities, totaling over $40,000. Then he paused and said, off the record, that he'd advised against this approach, but his client had insisted. He said I should expect formal paperwork within a week. I thanked him for the warning and hung up, my hand shaking. I called Flora to let her know what was happening in case. My mother tried contacting my work again. Flora gave me the name of an employment lawyer she knew who also handled family law issues. The lawyer I consulted was a woman in her 50s who listened to my whole story without interrupting. When I finished, she actually laughed and said my mother had no case whatsoever. She explained that parents can't retroactively bill adult children for expenses they chose to pay, that it would set an insane legal precedent. She said my mother's financial control and monitoring actually strengthened my case if I wanted to pursue charges for financial abuse. She asked if I wanted to countersue, and I said no. I just wanted my mother to leave me alone. The lawyer drafted a cease and desist letter that laid out exactly why my mother's legal threat was baseless and warned that continued harassment could result in me seeking a restraining order. We sent it through official channels with delivery confirmation. The whole consultation cost me $300, but it was worth it for the peace of mind. For days later, my phone rang from the same attorney who'd called before. He said my mother was dropping the legal threat and that he was withdrawing from representing her because she refused to take his advice. He apologized off the record for wasting my time and said he hoped I was doing okay. I could hear genuine concern in his voice and wondered what my mother had said or done to make her own lawyer quit. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a small victory, but also dread about what my mother would try next. Betty called 2 days later, sounding frustrated. She said my mother had been telling people I stole money from her and that Jessica was part of an elaborate con to defraud her. Betty had tried to correct the story with other family members, but my mother had gotten to them first, and several now refused to listen to alternative explanations. Betty said my Uncle Mark and his whole family had completely sided with my mother and were spreading her version at family gatherings. My cousin Beth, who I'd been close with growing up, had apparently called me a manipulative liar on social media. Betty said she was still on my side, but wanted me to know what I was up against. I thanked her for the warning and felt sick thinking about how many people believed my mother's lies. Part of me wanted to call each family member and explain the truth. But Gladys had warned me about getting sucked into defending myself to people who'd already chosen sides. Khaled texted me about a work event at his new company, a networking mixer for professionals in our field. I almost said no, remembering how my mother used to critique every word I said at professional gatherings. But I forced myself to go, wearing an outfit I'd chosen myself and arriving without checking in with anyone. The event was at a rooftop bar downtown, and about 50 people mingled with drinks and appetizers. Khaled introduced me to his coworkers, and I found myself actually enjoying the conversations. Nobody was judging my every word or watching to make sure I worked correctly. I talked to a product manager about a project her team was struggling with and ended up offering some suggestions based on my experience. She asked for my contact information for potential freelance consulting work. I gave her my card without second-guessing myself or worrying about whether I was allowed to take on extra projects. On the drive home, I realized I hadn't thought about my mother once during the entire event. 2 days later, I got a friend request on social media from an account I didn't recognize. The profile picture was a generic sunset photo, and the name was obviously fake. I clicked through to the profile and saw it had been created that day, with no posts or friends. Something felt off, so I looked closer at the profile picture. When I zoomed in, I could see the edge of a frame around the sunset photo, like someone had taken a picture of a printed photograph. My heart sank. I recognized that frame. It was from my mother's house, from a photo that used to sit on her mantel. She'd taken a picture of a picture to use as a profile photo, probably not realizing the frame would show. I blocked the account immediately and went through all my privacy settings, changing everything to friends only. I made my profile completely invisible to anyone I wasn't already connected with. Then I checked my other social media accounts and found 2 more suspicious new profiles that had tried to follow me. I blocked those 2 and felt the familiar anxiety creeping back in, the sense that I could never fully escape her watching. I scheduled a session with Gladys for the following week and spent the time trying to put my feelings into words. When I sat down in her office, she asked me what I was struggling with most, and I told her it was the weird combination of relief and sadness that hit me at random times throughout the day. She nodded and explained that grief doesn't only apply to death, that I was mourning the mother I should have had instead of the one I got. We spent the next hour talking about how I could acknowledge the loss without letting it pull me back into the toxic pattern. She said I was allowed to be sad about losing family connections while still protecting myself from people who hurt me. She gave me exercises for when the guilt crept in, ways to remind myself that healthy relationships don't require surveillance cameras and tracking apps. I left feeling like someone finally understood that freedom could hurt even when it was the right choice. The next morning at work, Flora knocked on my door during a video call and held up a massive bouquet of roses with an apologetic expression. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly who sent them. Flora mouthed that she'd handle it and disappeared before I could respond. An hour later, she sent me an email explaining she'd called the local hospital and arranged for them to be donated to patients who might enjoy them. She wrote that she hoped I didn't mind her intervening, but that she figured I didn't need that kind of stress at work. I sent back a thank you that probably didn't capture how much her quiet protection meant to me. She responded with a simple thumbs-up emoji, and we never discussed it again, which somehow made it even more meaningful. For months after the restaurant confrontation, my cousin sent me a wedding invitation with a handwritten note saying she'd understand if I didn't come, but really hoped I would. I knew my mother would be there, and spent 3 days agonizing over whether to go or send my regrets. Kylie told me I shouldn't let my mother take away more family connections than she already had. I called Gladys, and we spent 2 sessions preparing for every possible scenario, practicing what I'd say if my mother approached me and how I'd remove myself from situations that felt unsafe. Gladys reminded me that I could leave at any time and that staying wasn't required just because I showed up. I bought a new dress that my mother would have hated and asked Kylie to come with me as moral support. The wedding was at a hotel downtown, with a ceremony in a ballroom and a reception in an attached garden area. I arrived exactly when the ceremony started, so I wouldn't have to make small talk beforehand. My mother sat 3 rows ahead of me, and I watched the back of her head through the entire ceremony, my heart beating so hard I could barely hear the vows. During the reception, I stuck close to Kylie and stayed on the opposite side of the garden from wherever my mother was standing. I saw her notice me twice and start walking in my direction. Both times I calmly excused myself from whatever conversation I was in and moved to a different area. Several aunts and uncles watched this happen, whispering to each other, some looking sympathetic, others disapproving. My supportive aunt gave me a subtle nod the second time I walked away, which helped me feel less like I was being dramatic. I made it through the dinner service by sitting at a table far from my mother's, though I could feel her staring at me through the speeches and toasts. I was heading to the bathroom when my mother appeared from around a corner and blocked my path. She had tears running down her face and reached for my hands, begging for just 5 minutes to talk. She said she'd been going to therapy twice a week and finally understood what she'd done wrong. I pulled my hands back and told her I was glad she was getting help, but that I wasn't ready for contact yet. She followed me as I walked away, her voice getting louder as she pleaded for me to just listen. My supportive aunt appeared between us and physically stepped in front of my mother, telling her firmly to respect my boundaries or leave the wedding. My mother's face crumpled, and she started sobbing about how everyone was against her. She left through the garden exit with several cousins following her. Shooting angry looks at me over their shoulders. The remaining family members, my 2 supportive aunts and 3 cousins I'd been close with as kids, gathered around me near the dessert table. One aunt apologized for not recognizing how bad things were, and one of my cousins admitted she always thought the tracking apps were too much, but didn't feel like it was her place to say anything. We spent the next hour having real conversations about what my childhood was actually like, and they listened without trying to defend my mother or minimize what happened. Kylie stayed nearby, but gave me space to reconnect with family who actually wanted to know the truth. I drove home feeling completely exhausted, but also lighter somehow, like I'd proven to myself that I could be in the same space as my mother without breaking my boundaries. Kylie told me I'd handled everything with impressive calm and strength, which made me tear up because I definitely hadn't felt calm on the inside. 3 days later, my mother sent an email with a subject line that made my blood run cold before I even opened it. She wrote that she couldn't live with herself anymore, knowing I hated her, and that if I didn't contact her within 24 hours, she was going to hurt herself because there was no point in living if I was gone from her life. I stared at my phone, shaking, and called Gladys immediately, barely able to explain what the email said. Gladys talked me down from the panic and explained this was a common manipulation tactic that people with my mother's patterns used when other methods stopped working. She helped me understand that responding would only teach my mother that threats worked, and instead we should contact Adult Protective Services for a wellness check. Gladys walked me through the call, and I reported that my mother had sent concerning messages about self-harm. The social worker took down all the information and said they'd send someone to check on her within a few hours. I spent those hours pacing my apartment and checking my phone every few minutes, terrified that I'd made the wrong choice by not responding directly. The social worker called back that evening and reported that my mother was physically fine and had been referred to mental health resources. The social worker mentioned almost casually that my mother had a pattern of using crisis threats for attention, based on previous calls from other family members over the years. That detail hit me harder than anything else, because it meant I wasn't the first person she'd tried this manipulation on. And knowing that helped me feel less guilty about maintaining my boundary instead of rushing to save her. I threw myself into work like I'd never been able to before, opening my laptop each morning without that sick feeling in my stomach, waiting for my mother to check what I was doing. Flora noticed the difference in my performance during our weekly video calls and mentioned how much more confident I seemed in presenting my ideas. My project completion rate doubled over the next month because I wasn't constantly interrupted by tracking app notifications or surprise video calls demanding I explain why I'd opened a particular website. Flora called me into a virtual meeting 6 weeks after the Adult Protective Services incident and told me she was promoting me to senior coordinator with a $15,000 raise. I stared at my screen in shock because I'd never imagined I could advance this quickly. But Flora explained my work quality had been outstanding, and the team specifically requested me for their projects. The raise meant I could finally afford a nicer apartment without paying cash under the table, and I realized I'd built something real that my mother couldn't touch or sabotage. Khaled sent me a congratulations text after I posted about the promotion on LinkedIn, and we met for coffee that weekend to celebrate. We'd been meeting every few weeks since reconnecting, talking about our controlling mothers, and swapping stories about setting boundaries. But this time felt different somehow. He brought me flowers and admitted he'd been wanting to ask me out properly for months, but didn't want to pressure me while I was dealing with so much family chaos. I felt scared in a way I hadn't expected, like letting someone get close meant giving them power to hurt me. But I also wanted to try, because Khaled understood what it was like to fight for independence from a parent who claimed to love you while suffocating you. We decided to start dating casually, with clear communication about my trust issues, and he shared that his own mother still tried to control his career choices by threatening to disown him if he didn't become a doctor like she wanted. Hearing him talk about his boundaries helped me feel less alone in this weird space between freedom and guilt. 2 months into dating, my supportive aunt invited me to a family dinner at her house, and I almost said no until she promised my mother wouldn't be there. I arrived with Kylie as backup and found my aunt, 2 cousins, and an uncle I'd always liked gathered around her dining room table. We were halfway through the meal when someone knocked loudly on the front door, and my aunt's face went pale. My mother's voice came through the door, demanding to be let in, saying she knew I was there and just wanted to talk for 5 minutes. My aunt stood up and walked to the door, but didn't open it, speaking through the wood that my mother needed to leave immediately or she'd call the police. My mother started crying and begging, saying her own sister was keeping her from her daughter and that this was cruel and unusual. My aunt's voice stayed firm as she repeated that my mother needed to respect my boundaries and that showing up uninvited proved she wasn't ready for contact. My mother screamed that everyone had turned against her and that I'd poisoned the whole family with lies. My aunt pulled out her phone and started dialing, which made my mother finally leave, her car tires squealing as she drove away too fast. I sat frozen at the table with my hands shaking while my aunt came back and apologized for not anticipating my mother might track me there. My uncle mentioned he'd seen my mother's car parked down the street earlier, but didn't think much of it at the time. The rest of dinner felt tense, and I left early, but I was grateful my aunt had actually enforced the boundary instead of letting my mother guilt her way inside. Gladys and I spent my next therapy session talking about how my mother's behavior probably wouldn't change significantly, no matter how much therapy she got. Gladys explained that people with my mother's level of control issues rarely develop true insight, because admitting they were wrong meant confronting years of harmful behavior. I cried harder than I had since the restaurant confrontation, grieving the mother I wished I had instead of the one who existed. Gladys helped me understand that accepting the family split as permanent didn't mean I was giving up. It meant I was choosing reality over fantasy. She also pointed out all the genuine relationships I'd built over the past 6 months with Flora, Khaled, Kylie, and my supportive family members, celebrating how I'd created a chosen family that actually respected my independence. I left that session feeling sad, but also lighter somehow, like I'd finally stopped carrying the weight of trying to fix something that was never mine to fix. Jessica texted me asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, and we chose a place halfway between our neighborhoods. She looked completely different with short hair and confident body language, telling me she'd landed a recurring role on a streaming show and was finally making enough money to quit survival jobs. We laughed about the absurdity of her pretending to be me for 3 months. But she also mentioned how the experience made her recognize controlling patterns in her own family that she'd normalized. Jessica had started setting boundaries with her parents about their expectations for her career, and they'd reacted badly at first, but were slowly adjusting. She thanked me for inadvertently showing her what healthy boundaries looked like, which made me laugh because I'd felt like I was barely surviving most days. We promised to stay in touch and left as actual friends instead of just collaborators in my weird escape plan. My birthday arrived with a card in my mailbox that made my stomach drop. My mother had somehow found my new address despite all my precautions, and the envelope contained a check for $500 with a note saying she'd always love me even if I hated her. The note included details about how she was going to therapy and learning about boundaries, but also guilt-inducing lines about how she couldn't sleep, knowing I thought she was a monster. I stared at the check for a long time before tearing it in half and writing my own note explaining that I didn't hate her, but I also wouldn't accept money with strings attached. I reiterated my boundary about only having contact if she respected my independence and continued therapy, then mailed everything back to her address. Khaled found me crying on my couch that night and just held me while I explained how much it hurt that my mother still couldn't respect even basic boundaries like not stalking my address. Kylie became one of my closest friends over the following months, and we started hiking together every weekend. She joked about our weird origin story, but she also mentioned I seemed like a completely different person from the anxious woman Jessica had described. I'd gained weight in a healthy way after years of my mother monitoring my portions, and I dressed in clothes I actually liked. Kylie said I smiled more and made eye contact during conversations instead of constantly checking my phone for monitoring notifications. Hearing her describe the change made me realize how much I'd grown without even noticing. The holidays brought another family gathering at my supportive aunt's house, and I knew going in that half the family would boycott because I'd be there. I arrived to find my 2 supportive aunts, 3 cousins, and 1 uncle present, while the rest of the family had chosen my mother's side. It stung seeing the empty chairs, and knowing those relatives believed I was the villain. But I also enjoyed real conversations with the people who showed up. We created new traditions without my mother's controlling presence, playing games, and sharing stories that actually felt genuine instead of performed for her approval. Khaled and I had been dating for 4 months when he asked if we could talk seriously about our future. I felt my chest tighten with old panic, but forced myself to stay present and listen. He shared his own fears about commitment after watching his parents' toxic marriage and his vulnerabilities about whether he was capable of being a good partner. I cried while explaining how scared I was of recreating my mother's patterns or being controlled again, and how I sometimes pushed him away when we got too close. We talked for hours about what we both needed and wanted, and decided we were willing to work through our issues together instead of running away. 2 weeks later, an email arrived from my mother's therapist through proper professional channels. The therapist emphasized there was no pressure and that my mother had been making genuine progress in therapy over the past several months. She asked if I'd be willing to attend 1 family therapy session with specific conditions including my right to leave at any time and the session being focused on my needs rather than my mother's. I sat with the email for 3 days before responding that I'd consider it, but needed strict rules about format, topics, and my ability to end the session immediately if my boundaries weren't respected. The therapist agreed to all my conditions, and we scheduled a session for the following month, giving me time to prepare extensively with Gladys first. I spent the next 2 weeks meeting with Gladys 3 times to prepare. We practiced responses to likely manipulation tactics and rehearsed what I'd say if my mother tried guilt trips or threats. Gladys helped me write down my boundaries on index cards I could reference if I got overwhelmed. And we role-played scenarios where my mother might cry or play victim. I memorized phrases like, "I need a break," and "this session is over for me," so I could leave if things got bad. Gladys reminded me that I controlled whether this happened at all, that agreeing to one session didn't mean I owed my mother anything, and that I could change my mind right up until I walked into that office. The day of the session arrived, and I drove to the therapist's office with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My mother was already in the waiting room when I arrived, looking smaller than I remembered, her hair grayer and her face lined with stress. She started to stand when she saw me, but her therapist, a calm woman in her 50s, gently guided her back to her seat and asked us both to follow her to the office. The therapist explained the ground rules before we started, emphasizing that I could leave any time and that the focus would be on accountability and realistic expectations, not reconciliation pressure. My mother nodded along, but kept glancing at me with a desperate hope that made my stomach tight. When the therapist asked my mother to share what she'd learned in therapy, my mother took a shaky breath and apologized for installing the tracking apps and cameras. She said she understood now that monitoring my location constantly was wrong and that making me video call every morning to show my outfit was controlling. She admitted that calling my boss and declining the job offer on my behalf crossed a line, and that threatening to hurt herself when I tried to set boundaries was manipulation. Her voice cracked as she listed each behavior, tears running down her face, and part of me wanted to comfort her the way I'd been trained to do my whole life. But I also noticed what she didn't say, the things she framed as protection rather than control, the way she described her actions as mistakes instead of abuse. The therapist asked how I felt hearing the apology, and I took a moment to check my index cards before responding. I thanked my mother for acknowledging specific behaviors and said I appreciated her willingness to attend therapy. Then I explained that one apology after months of therapy didn't rebuild 26 years of broken trust, that I needed to see consistent, respectful behavior over years before I could consider a real relationship. My mother started crying harder and reached for my hand across the space between our chairs, but I pulled back and kept talking. I told her that trust wasn't something she could demand or schedule like she scheduled everything else in my life, that I needed time to heal from the damage her control had caused. She sobbed that she couldn't wait years, that she needed her daughter back now. But the therapist gently interrupted and supported my timeline. The therapist explained to my mother that realistic expectations meant accepting that repair would be slow and that pushing for faster reconciliation would only damage things further. My mother cried but nodded, and I felt a small flicker of hope that maybe the therapy was actually helping her understand something. I spent the last 20 minutes of the session outlining my terms for limited contact while my mother listened and twisted tissues in her hands. I said we could have lunch once a month in public restaurants that I would choose, with no tracking or monitoring of any kind before or after. I said she couldn't show up at my home or workplace unannounced, and that if she violated that boundary even once, contact would stop immediately. I required that we both continue individual therapy and that she provide proof from her therapist every 3 months that she was attending sessions. My mother agreed to everything desperately, promising she'd follow every rule perfectly, and I felt exhausted by how quickly she was accepted terms she would have raged against months ago. I stood to leave, and my mother asked if she could hug me, her voice small and pleading. I said no, and walked out of the office, my hands shaking, but my steps steady, feeling cautiously hopeful while protecting myself from expecting too much change too fast. 1 year after the restaurant confrontation, I woke up in my own apartment that I decorated myself next to Khaled, who knew everything about my past and loved me anyway. I made coffee without checking my phone for tracking notifications and got dressed in clothes I'd chosen because I liked them. My morning routine belonged to me now. No video calls to prove I was wearing approved outfits. No texts demanding to know why I was running 5 minutes behind schedule. I worked my remote job from my desk by the window, and Flora sent me a message congratulating me on another successful project completion. At lunch, I met Kylie for our weekly hike, and we talked about her new relationship and my upcoming promotion. Real conversations between real friends who'd chosen each other. My mother and I had maintained monthly lunches for 8 months now, sometimes good and sometimes tense, with her respecting most boundaries most of the time. She still struggled with asking permission instead of demanding information. Still sometimes showed up early to restaurants hoping to catch me off guard. Still occasionally sent guilt-inducing texts about how much she missed the old days. But I'd learned to enforce consequences calmly, canceling lunches when she pushed too hard and refusing to engage with manipulation attempts. Some family relationships remained fractured and probably always would, with 3 uncles and several cousins who still believed I'd abandoned my mother for selfish reasons. But my 2 supportive aunts hosted regular dinners where I felt accepted, and I'd built genuine connections with cousins who'd broken free from their own controlling parents. I'd created a chosen family of friends who respected my autonomy, who never demanded to know my location or question my choices, who celebrated my independence instead of trying to control it. Khaled and I had hard conversations about boundaries and fears, working through moments when my past trauma made me push him away, or when his own family issues triggered old patterns. Gladys continued to help me process the complicated grief of losing my mother while having her partially present, of accepting that she might never fully understand the harm she caused. I still jumped sometimes when my phone rang unexpectedly, still felt my chest tighten when someone asked too many questions about my schedule, still carried the weight of 26 years of surveillance in ways that surprised me. But I was learning who I was without constant monitoring, discovering interests my mother had never approved, and making choices based on what I wanted instead of what would avoid her anger. My mother backslid regularly, testing boundaries and sometimes crossing them, requiring me to reinforce consequences and reset expectations. The path to freedom had been more complicated and painful than I'd imagined, filled with grief and anger and fear alongside the relief and joy. But I was proud of the life I'd created, proud of the boundaries I maintained, proud of choosing myself, even when it meant losing people who couldn't accept my autonomy. I was finally living authentically, finally learning to trust my own judgment, finally building a life that belonged completely to me. This journey has been the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most rewarding. I'm curious, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to fight this hard for your own independence? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to know what you think.